recording now. So again, welcome to everybody. We'll be making the video available to you, hopefully within 24 hours via email as well, if you want to revisit this. So now, where are we? Next slide. It's necessary that we put the disclaimer up. I am not a medical expert by any means. We do refer you to the government website or your personal GP for any personal medical advice. The content today is very general in nature. Whilst we try to make it as relevant as possible, it hasn't been written with any one client's individual circumstances in mind. We are keen to take your calls or respond to your emails if you have any personal questions. Finally, much of today is very standard publicly available information. Much of it is my opinion over what's happening. So again, if you have any questions, I'm not really speaking for Retirinvest. Otherwise you'd be getting far blander commentary than you're going to get out of me today. So I'm going to do my very best, but understanding that today is in fact a general kind of conversation, not a personally applicable one. So let's have a quick look at COVID-19. These were the stats as of about 8:30 last night. It stands for coronavirus disease number 19, or coronavirus designated number 19. It was originally identified in December last year. It comes from a family of viruses that we're actually quite familiar with. The common cold for one, SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, forgive the typo there, MERS, Middle East respiratory syndrome. Whilst it is very similar in many symptoms to the flu, it's actually not in the same family of viruses as the flu. Now, as of last night, there were 565 cases. I believe that's 700 today. But the statistics here are interesting. Around about half of them come from people that came back from overseas. About 13% came from people that were in contact with people that came from overseas. There's about 36% as yet unidentified, but will probably fall into the same ratio. And there's about 5% of people, there's just no understanding where it came from. It probably came from being next to someone in a shopping centre that sneezed. As we look at it, it is really helpful to understand exactly how dangerous this thing is by comparison to other common pathogens. So the COVID-19 virus is roughly equivalent in infectionability, if you want to call it that, or as the common cold or the common flu. It's a little bit more dangerous than the common flu, but it's roughly as dangerous as the measles. It kills about as many, or the mortality rate's about as many. It's a little less dangerous than the chickenpox, although the chickenpox is far more infectious, and so is the measles, something like 4 or 5 times more infectious. The common cold is about as infectious as the COVID-19 virus, but far less long-term danger. What we've found is that it affects people with significant respiratory illness. Now in China, and I was talking to people in South Korea last night at about 5 o'clock, but in China, what they found is that a lot of the older people that were victim to the pollution in China, being inside and being out of the pollution and the reduction in pollution, they've actually had an increase in the longevity of the average 80-year-old in China over the course of this period, rather than a decrease. So believe it or not, COVID-19 has actually been good for the elderly population, although it's having a very strong economic impact. In Australia, this was as of yesterday, there were 500, and I'm going to play with some numbers here for you, and I hope this is of some value, but there were 500 or 600 people infected in Australia as of yesterday. Assume they were all wandering around the streets sneezing on people, which is not true by any means. There's hardly anyone out there. But with the 25 million people in Australia, that gives us about a 1 chance in 40,000 of actually bumping into one of these people. Now, if we further assume that there's a 100% chance of infection, which is patently wrong, it's actually something like 2% chance if you come into contact, then we end up with some interesting statistics. Now, I've broken this up into the age bands, and I want you to look at the chance of there being mortality from these events with each age band. So for anyone over 80, the chance of COVID-19 as of yesterday being fatal is around 1 in 300,000. Now, the chance of a car crash is a little bit more likely. the chance of cancer or any other cause, to be honest, once you're over 80, the chance of dying in any given year is about 1 in 17, or about 6%. So that means that the COVID-19 virus is about 17,000 times less likely to cause you to pass away. Over 70, there's about a 1 in 50 chance you're going to have a bad year, and the virus itself is about 10,000 times less likely to be dangerous. Over 60, the numbers remarkably are that it's about only 9,000 times more dangerous, although the chance of any of you having a bad year from 60 to 70 is around about a little bit less than 1%. For the people in my age profile over 50, the chance of me falling off my perch in the next 12 months is about 0.3%, 1 in 300. And the chance of this virus being a drama for me is about 10,000 times less likely than some other cause. So I find this to be just an interesting way of looking at it, going, every time we get in the car and go out, it's more likely we're going to have a problem, much more likely we're going to have a problem than we're going to catch this virus. And even if we did catch a virus, it's much less likely that we're going to have any sort of serious illness from it, which is not to dismiss the truth of some people being very ill from this virus, and I don't want to seem insensitive. But I think Australians have responded quite intelligently, except for the toilet paper problems and the flour and the tissues. Most people find it quite almost sanguine about it. Curiously enough, my observation has been with the majority of our clients is they're actually of the opinion, well, we always knew something was going to get us. We're not going to change our lifestyle now. So I find that people in their 30s, 40s and 50s are more worried about their older folk than the older folk themselves, which I don't know if that is your observation, but I've found most clients to be quite relaxed about it, saying, well, what will be, will be. Okay, so let's have a look at the definition of a pandemic, because this is when it suddenly took off around the world. Most people have heard of the 1918 Spanish flu, and it was actually quite a serious flu. Perhaps it was comparable in nastiness to this bug. However, back then there was no controls at all, no hygiene, no therapies, no nothing. So it's not a legitimate comparison. If we look at the seasonal flu, this is the one that we get every year. It affects about 9% of the world's population, which is approximately 630 million people a year get the common flu. And worldwide, there's deaths of up to 650,000 people. Now, I would be surprised if we see deaths approaching 30 or 40 from the COVID-19 virus. I'm not an expert, as I say, but they're doing taking very strong measures. So the seasonal flu is actually going to be a greater risk than COVID-19 to any individual person. Now, SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome from 2002, was actually quite nasty as a bug, but it was nowhere near as infectious as this beast or the common flu. The swine flu from 2009 was in fact a very, very infectious disease. The suggestion is it actually affected about 24% of the world's population, but its mortality rate was significantly lower. Although I'm fairly confident that we're going to find that SARS was a far nastier bug in terms of world population than this one has been. Ebola is a very nasty case. In fact, it was so dangerous that it didn't spread very far at all. Approached somewhere in the order of 50% according to the healthline.com website. To date, the COVID-19 virus has got 127,000 people around the world, but we're talking millions and billions in these other common antigen bacteria and viruses. The death rate was fairly high at the beginning, but seems to be settling down, certainly in Australia, around or below 1%. Given that it seems to have largely left the Asian part of the world and moved to Europe and America and Australia, I think we're going to see a much lower death rate than 3.4%. What I will say, and if any of you have listened to me in the past, you know I'm not a fan of the media. I don't think they have our best interests at heart. They say they do, but I think they're far more interested in creating an emotional response. When you look at mentions in the media, when you compare to previous viruses, HIV, 70 million mentions, the SARS virus, which is the better one to compare with, it's relatively recent, only 66 million views. Most of us have never even heard of the MERS virus, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which I think is a COVID-14 or 12 or something like that. Yet somewhere along the line, the coronavirus or the COVID-19 virus has got to 2 billion mentions. Now, the truth is most of this is coming of late with the academic impact, but I'm not a fan of people rabble-rousing, and I think social media is going to have a lot to answer for by the time this is done, because the reporting simply doesn't focus on the illness or the symptoms, it focuses on the incidence of infection. So Gavin, I'm noticing people are raising their hands. Again, if you can click on the chat box icon and send a question through, that makes it easier for us to see the question and respond to it. So again, I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation in the years to come after this particular event, where we're looking at the responsibility of the media and the responsibility of social media platforms, as well as the individual, to not rabble-rouse about this. So good news. The Canadians came out within the first a couple of weeks ago saying that they've found a treatment for it. Certainly many of you will be familiar with the Australian treatment, that they claim they've got some antiviral drugs, and that's very relevant. There's a couple of graphs I'm going to show you later. China reported the second day running with no incidence of subsequent infection, so that's tremendous. Last night, the European Central Bank took very strong action to prop up the Spanish and the Italian economies. They're going to take more, but 750 billion euro is the equivalent of 1.5 trillion Australian dollars, thereabouts. And that's going to provide a massive injection into the economy. So I know, as I said, I was talking to someone in South Korea last night. My brother imports a lot of tiles. He owns a business in Victoria. The Spanish and the Italian building industry has not slowed down at all. They have simply stopped going to the shops and the coffee shops. Manufacturing is continuing in Europe apace. Imports and exports are continuing. So the economic impact here is somewhat distorted by the news to a certain extent. One of the great news, as we said, was China's pretty much plateaued. There's no new cases in China. The chap I was talking to in South Korea last night, he's a Spanish gentleman that involved in the building industry. He said for a little while there, things did slow down, but he imports tiles again from Spain, and said that the small businesses and the big businesses in South Korea have now started spending money again. The bit I like about this is if you look at the incident here, in South Korea, it was 1 month. It jumped out of control, they took action, and the infection rate plummeted to down to very manageable levels. Now, because of that, the economy of South Korea is recovering quite quickly. And again, chatting with someone in Shanghai, they said in the last week, 40% of people working in Shanghai have gone back to work, and they're expecting that to jump up to 60% next week and 80% the week after. So this is not just doing what's happening in Australia right now where people are working from home. This is people returning to the workplace because the risk of infection from the virus has passed. So once people are back in the workplace, they'll be buying coffee, buying sandwiches, catching the train, hiring taxis, and going out to dinner again. And so the good news here is we're seeing, as you look at this, the Chinese experience was from pretty much zero to plateau of about 4 weeks. The Korean experience is almost identical. So I think we're going to see the same thing happen here where, I mean, let's be honest, this country's close to being in shutdown now. This might continue for another couple of weeks, but it is unlikely based on, the Asian experience that it's going to continue for a prolonged period, which is good news. Now, I'm not sure, but does anyone have any questions at this point? Is that a reasonable summary as far as we're concerned? I'm not seeing any questions coming in on the keyboard. And Chris, if you want to put a note on the bottom of the screen, I can't see anything, so I might continue. Okay, so let's talk about investments. How is this going to affect your investments? And then we're going to come and we're going to talk about how it affects you personally, not infects you, forgive me. So what did China and Korea do? Well, basically they communicated the rules very clearly, and they said to all their residents, do this and don't do that. And they generally obeyed. They actually, using social media, which is stronger in China and Korea, they're actually able to track the behavior of the individuals. So the people were actually incredibly compliant. But the Chinese kept the toilet paper and the rice and the coffee flowing. And as a result, there was no breakdown in the social order at all. They created infectious disease care centres, which allowed the people that were infected to be picked up straight away. Believe it or not, in Korea, they tested everybody that they could. They made it mandatory to be tested. If you were tested and you weren't infected with the virus, you paid $150. If you were tested and you were infected with the virus, it didn't cost you anything. And that way they incentivized people to come forward if they weren't feeling well. They used electronic recording and tracking systems to measure what's going on down to the suburb level. And it was very effective. So we're going to see this coming into our society over the next couple of years, I think. The reality of the telephone that we all hold is that it creates, you can't see my phone on the screen, curiously enough, it creates a tremendous mechanism for the government to speak with us. And finally, they controlled the media, and this is where I think we're going to see some conversation about that over the next year or two in this country. And to be quite honest, my opinion is it's about time. So if we look at the swine flu, which was about 10 years ago, and this one was a significant event because there were quite a few people that were infected with it, and there were 284,000 people that died. The figures that I got were from a government health chart, whereas this one seems to be slightly different. But in any event, the fast facts in the red box are consistent anyway. The thing that's interesting there is what happened in the share market after the World Health Organization announced a pandemic level. So this is the US stock market, and it had quite a profound fall, 10, 12% fall. The minute that they began testing the vaccine, the stock market said, oh, well, this will pass now, we've got this under control. So if you look at the scale across the bottom of this graph here, we're talking about a period of pretty much 12 months from, I'll just get a highlighter up here, 12 months from May there to sort of May, June there. The virus ended and the stock market had actually returned very positive figures in that time. So historically, if we look at all the major outbreaks, we see that most of them didn't respond negatively like they have this time. And by the time you get to the 12-month mark, we're seeing essentially nothing but positive returns. So there really is no correlation with a negative outcome from these sort of events over a 6 to 12-month period. Where we need to be conscious of things is that this time the markets have been running very hot for quite a long time. So I know in meeting with many of you over the last 12 months, we've talked about the fact that there probably was a negative year coming. I don't know if most will remember that. We felt that we were in for a drop of about 10 to 15%. So if you will, that would be from the 7,000 point on the Australian stock market down to about 6,000. That was expected. It was never going to last forever, but it was sort of expected. Now, historically, we know that getting out of the market is the worst thing you can do. Now, my gut instinct here is that the infection of the COVID-19 virus has added another 10 to 15% to the market decline, which has brought us down the 25 to 30 that we're seeing. Now, I'll talk about the behavior of the markets in a minute, but the thing that I would look at here is that the current situation, I feel like we're right down here at the bottom of the stock market. So very much in this, if I come back to that graph here, we're very much at this point here now. There's so many reasons to see positive, but the uncertainty is what's keeping us down at the moment. So what happened this time? And this is where I'm going to get myself in trouble. But in my opinion, this time the media and the government decided that they could try to stop the infection of the virus all around the world. They didn't really try with the previous events. They didn't try with the SARS. They didn't try with the MERS. They didn't try with the various other events. They certainly don't try with the flu anymore. They just give everyone a vaccine. This time, they decided to try to stop it. And the consequences are significant in terms of keeping people out of at work. This has become a question of employment, not a question of infection. The truth is we lose 50,000 people a year to the influenza virus in Australia, and no one even blinks. We're going to be lucky, or not lucky, we'll be unlucky if we exceed 20 in this country. Deaths according to the virus, and maybe even 100, but it won't be significant in the grand scheme of the economy. But this time they decided to try and stop it. And I think we're going to see that question asked quite a few times over the next year or so as to whether that was the appropriate response. So how does the economy work, and how is this going to affect your investments and the economy? So in a simple kind of gill way of looking at it, the governments all around the world print money. They then give that money to the banks, and the banks then hand it out to businesses and individuals to buy houses and to buy cars and to start a business, right? Now, one thing that may not be immediately obvious to people is that banks have only got a limited amount of money in circulation, and they frequently, as in almost daily, borrow money from each other overnight to just pay their settlements for the day. And that works quite well as a mechanism because they all pay a little bit of interest to each other, and the banks all over the world lend money to each other. Now, some of you may have heard me talking about the Greek debt crisis 3 or 4 years ago in Europe and what happened there. And the short version is, if you look at those pictures, B1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 up there, imagine that B5, Bank 5, are the Greek banks. And the French, the Germans, the Russians, the UK banks, the Americans and the Australians have all been lending money to each other happily. Now the banks lend money to business and consumers, and they help each other overnight. Now that causes what we call a velocity of money. So for every dollar the government prints, it goes into the banks, who then lend it to the homeowner that buys a house, who then pays the money to the business owner, the carpenter who builds the house, and he buys materials from the person at Bunnings, who then goes and buys coffee from the person next door, and around and round this dollar goes. The initial target for velocity of money in our society was about 7 times. For every dollar that's spent, it should be spent 7 times. So that term velocity of money is quite important because at the end of the day, the government wants the money to keep moving around the country and around the world. Now, how does it go wrong? So when the Greek banks had a problem, when the Greek government had a problem a few years ago, the French and the Germans and the European banks said to the Greek banks, do you have any problems with your debts? And they said, oh no, we have no problems. We're backed by the Greek government. But then the Greek government was basically saying, we have no money left. So we're going to probably default on our bonds. So what if Bank 5 has a problem where all of a sudden the rest of the European banks don't want to lend to the Greek banks anymore? What happens is the banks that lent to the Greek banks suddenly start to get nervous. So the money starts to slow down. All the banks slow down their lending. They say, look, we'd love to lend you money, but I'm sorry, we're not going to. We're a bit nervous or a bit short today. We'll help you, call us next week, sort of thing. And the same thing happened here in America with when the global financial crisis and the mortgage-backed securities, where the banks suddenly stopped talking to each other. And so the money wasn't lent, and they built up their cash reserves in case something went wrong. And that meant that businesses couldn't borrow money to buy furniture and computers and cars and coffee machines and whatnot. And as a result, the money slowed down. Now, because the money slowed down, there was less employment, the government had less tax intake, and all of a sudden, we're in that dangerous word recession, which, by the way, a recession simply means that last year I earned $100,000, this year I only earned $99,000, and maybe the year after that, because there's not as much overtime, I'm only going to earn $98,000. So a recession doesn't mean we're going broke. Recession just means we didn't earn quite as much as last year. So all of a sudden, the problem with the Greek government became a problem with the Greek banking system, became a problem with the European banking system, and the money started to slow down. Now, are the banks around the world feeling safe right now? There's a very useful index that most people aren't aware of called the LIBOR rate, which is the London Interbank Over-the-Counter rate. And we watch these things. We don't normally bore you with them, but this mechanism is it's the rate at which banks lend money to each other. Now, broadly speaking, it follows the prevailing interest rates of the time. So if the interest rates are 5%, it'll be 4 or 5% as well. But the graph here is quite interesting. This is the LIBOR rate since 2005, over the last 15 years. We saw it going up, and then in the global financial crisis, when interest rates were dropping, the over-the-counter rate dropped precipitously down to almost zero. Now, as it comes along over here, we're seeing that it started to improve again, and that's because there was economic growth in Europe and America. But the interesting thing here in the global financial crisis are these little spikes that we see here, 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 and here. Each one of those spikes represents a situation where the banks of the world are starting to get nervous and don't want to lend money to each other. And they do that by increasing the rate at which the other bank has to pay if they take money out. There was one very big spike here, right, which will coincide with the point where the American government and the European government stepped in. Okay, but once they did step in, the rate dropped very quickly down to zero. So what we're finding, and this is the interesting piece, I got this graph a few days ago, but the over-the-counter rate, the LIBOR rate in the UK has not peaked. The banks are not nervous. There is a very high degree of confidence in the financial system at the moment, and the banks are not worried that everyone's going to go broke. We're not seeing that, and I don't know if anyone was aware of it, but the government of Australia printed $90 billion, or issued $90 billion, sorry, last night to the Australian banks. It said, lend this to small business, get it out there, give small business the money they need so that they can get through this period. And that's exactly what happens. So what can governments do if the thing starts to slow down? And it will slow down in this country and the rest of the world. One, they can make money cheaper. Okay, they do that by cutting interest rates. Well, you can't cut them much further, let's be honest. They're as low as they're going to go in America, and they're going to get there fairly quickly in Australia. The government can borrow money from the markets and spend it. It's called fiscal policy. And basically, it takes a year to 2 years for the government spending machine to ramp up and to create jobs out there. They build roads and bridges and expressways and things like that. And it does create work, which gets money moving again. The third way is to print it and give it to the banks or give it to the people. Now, they're going to do that in Australia. They've already, as I said, done it last night, gave $90 billion to the banks and said, get it out there. In addition, they're going to give it to people on welfare, on pensions and allowances, because people on welfare tend to spend everything they get. So that'll go into the supermarkets and to the petrol stations and things like that. So when you print it, it's called quantitative easing. Now, who's done it? In the last 10 years, pretty much everybody has. The Japanese have done it. The US has done it repeatedly. The UK has done it, and they're just about to start it again shortly. Switzerland's done it. Eurozone's done it. I think we're in a situation where the Australian government's going to do it shortly, because they can go into $200 or $300 billion worth of debt over this thing, or they can just print the money. Now, when they've printed the money, sorry, this was another thing. This is from last night. The European Central Bank deployed a bazooka and spent 750 billion euro to prop up Italy and Spain, because that's where the hotbed of the virus is in Europe at the moment. 750 billion euro is about 1.4 trillion Australian dollars. It's a staggering amount of money. So quantitative easing, there's plenty of graphs I could grab here, but this one's the US stock market. Starting in 2009, when I said that problem happened, they started printing money. So the blue bar is the quantitative easing period where they printed money, and the stock market went up. It then went down when they stopped, so they started printing again, it went up, had a little hiatus there for a little while, and they assured people they were going to do it, and the market took off after that. So in every case, Japan, Switzerland, the UK, Eurozone, America, when they print money, it has a fairly quick impact on the investment markets, and this is where most retirees are interested. I get that the economy will recover and the food will be available, although the toilet paper is going to be a problem. I think many of us are going to start hoarding newspapers soon. And it would take an older person to remember why that's funny. But what's really going on right now? Okay, how's this going to impact on things? So the Australian economy a couple of years ago was worth $1.9 trillion. That's $1,890 billion, which is, I don't understand how big that number is. It's a lot. When you look at the economy, most of our economy is built on services. We've got construction, mining, manufacturing is a shrinking base. Agriculture is actually more important than it used to be. And then the rest is hard to define. It's called other. That economy, if you look at the history of it, we've got to stimulate the economy. And given that most people, if we come back here, most of our employment these days happens in the service sector. That's people like us, it's healthcare, it's education, it's coffee shops and restaurants, it's tourism. All of these people are affected by the slowdown because quite simply people aren't moving. And I think everyone's seen overnight that they've pretty much shut the doors on Australia to everyone except Australian citizens. And it's going to take a year for that to rebuild. I don't know about any of you, but as soon as this is over, we plan to take a trip and visit spend your tourism dollar domestically. So I suspect many of you will be the same. So if we look at what's happened around the world at the moment, the Australian response up until last night was around about 1% of GDP. As of last night, we've now spent about $100 billion, or we're planning to spend about $100 billion, which is about 5% of our GDP, which is in line with what Euro and USA have spent. Curiously enough, the UK has announced that they're going to be spending 15% of their GDP, which for us translates to a $300 billion spend. Now, relative to the global financial crisis, that's a lot of money. And it actually will have an impact in Australia. It will genuinely turn things around, and we're going to see stock markets recovering quite strongly. Question is exactly how long it will take. Will it take a month? Will it take 3 months, 6 months, or 12? But historically, when we go through periods like this, it does fall. It does bounce along the bottom for a while. But as many of you have heard me say, I can't tell you when it's going to recover. I can tell you it will, because it always does. But I can't tell you exactly when it's going to recover. So all we can do is be invested, and we can wait, making sure that your portfolio doesn't get damaged along the way. So the most important thing in the equation here is that we've got to keep the unemployed working, or we've got to avoid unemployment, because that is what turns the money around. We've got to support employers. We've got to allow the government to do its job. And here we go, the computer has decided to be a problem. Allow the government to do its job and create cash flow. As I said, 5% of Australian GDP is around about 95 billion. Step one was 18 billion. The Prime Minister announced a little while ago, and they announced another 90 billion last night. So the right things are being done. These things do work. Where you have to spend it, welfare, business, tax cuts, spending on infrastructure, getting money out and supplied. But wait, there's more. If anyone's got any questions about that, I'm trying not to be too technical, but this is the things that drives the economy. There was one other thing that happened, which hasn't got a whole lot of media attention, to be honest, because it's not as emotional as the virus. This is King Farouk of Saudi Arabia, and the gentleman on the horse may be familiar with some of you, Vladimir Putin. Mr. Putin is an interesting gentleman, I think. It's the best way to say it. But there's other players out here as well. Forgive me, my computer's misbehaving ever so slightly. Come on, computer. Here we go. There's Mr. Trump, and there's this little chap in North Korea that many of you will have seen. To be honest, the guy on the right is just a puppet of this gentleman here, who's Xi Jinping, who's in charge of China. So when you look at what's going on in the world right now, when the Chinese economy started to slow down and the northern hemisphere had a relatively warm winter, the amount of oil being consumed in the world dropped. As a result, the Arabs plus Russia, which is now called OPEC plus, OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they wanted to drop the amount of oil being produced so as to keep the prices high. Russia basically said, no, we will not do this. And Russia said, stuff it, we're going to increase production and we're going to flood the world with oil. As a result, the oil dropped from $60 a barrel to $22 a barrel. Now, that sounded like, and the way the media reported it, it was an attack on the Arabs from the Russians. But that's not true. As oil plummeted, and it actually dropped more than 26%, but as it fell from $60 a barrel to 22, who does this hurt? It's actually quite interesting when we look at the cost of producing oil around the world. The Saudis are the cheapest producers of oil. That costs them $9 a barrel because basically they stick a straw in the ground and it comes out. The Russians can produce oil for about $19 a barrel. These figures are about a couple of years old, but they hold pretty well. The Americans produce oil at about $21 a barrel, and the US shale oil, which is the fracking industry, produces oil at $23 a barrel. So by driving the oil price down to $22 a barrel, the Russians are in fact attacking America. They're not attacking Saudis. So they're trying to disable America. They're trying to hurt the American economy. And to be truthful, they're not doing the UK's economy any favors either. And now, I don't want to say anything too controversial, but I think most people accept that Russia behaves as somewhat of a thug or a mafiosi gangster when it comes to their behavior on the world stage. I don't know that this one's going to be allowed to, I don't think the Russians are going to be allowed to get away with this one. It's going to be an interesting year or two in Russian politics. This is not the way a world power behaves. This is the way a thug behaves. And the Saudis were not trying to hurt America by increasing the oil price, but the Russians are trying to hurt anybody whose price of oil is expensive. Venezuela, Nigeria, Brazil are less important on the world scale, but the British and the Americans are going to be affected by this. So the reason this is important is that the US energy sector makes up a fairly decent percentage of the US stock market as well. So that was one of the other reasons that the stock market in America collapsed. It's also affected Australia's stock market with the BHPs and the Woodside Petroleums as well. Their price of oil is, their Woodside in particular is a very efficient oil producer as well, and they produce a lot of gas. So this one's quite an interesting thing on the sideline. It hasn't been the act of a friend to do this. Now, if any of you came to our seminar last year, you'll remember this slide. This is not somewhere I'd rather be. This is actually a center of the next 30 or 40 years of economic politics it's in the South China Sea. I've forgotten the name of the island, but I think everyone's aware of China going to great lengths to dominate the most valuable trade route in the world, which is the area from China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, across from the east coast of America, down through the Straits of Malacca, past Singapore. That area is phenomenally important to world trade. And China is basically building islands in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, to create a zone where they control what's happening. It's significant. And as many of you know, I'm no fan of the current American president. However, the previous president, who I thought was certainly much more attractive figure in the sense of the way he spoke and behaved, allowed the Chinese to have quite a strong presence in the South China Sea. So Obama withdrew a lot of American influence from that part of the world because he was a fairly soft and gentle international leader in that sense. Trump is by any means not like Barack Obama and has been pushing the Chinese back. So we're in an interesting position right now where China has absolutely been affected by the COVID-19 virus, where their international game is absolutely being resisted by the current American leadership, where the Russians are attacking America, where the Chinese now need America more than the Americans need the Chinese. I don't know if anyone remembered, but just before the COVID-19 problems, there was an announcement between America and China about reaching a trade agreement, and the stock market took off. I think we're in a situation where China is going to see that its best interests lie in opening free trade with America rather than restricting it, because my understanding is that China basically exports about 10 times as much to America as it imports from America. So the Chinese, having been through this terrible period with COVID-19 and shutting their country down, are going to want to restart their economy. And in doing so, they're going to basically need to clear the decks to allow the imports and the exports to flow again. So I think what we're going to find is that America might be the victor in the high stakes game that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping have been playing with each other. But Australia won't be far behind. Why don't my computer's still misbehaving? So if we look here, this graph's quite interesting. I'm more interested in the left-hand side of the graph than the right-hand side of the graph. The blue bars are Australia's trading partner 10 years ago, 12 years ago, right? And that was where Japan was the most important trading partner at that time, along with the EU. The pink bars are only a couple of years ago. So 10 years later, we have seen a significant change in the nature of our trade relationships. We have seen China become our single most important trading partner. And that's a good thing and a scary thing, and many of us know, and I won't comment on the politics of the last year or two. But the Chinese take our iron ore, they take our minerals, they take our coal, and they take our oil and gas. And a large part of their economic growth has been fueled on the materials Australia has provided. And a large part of Australia's economic success story over the last decade has come from China. In fact, you'd almost say the majority of it. That and immigration and the housing industry in this country. So we're in a situation where, for better or worse, our economy and our stock market is affected by the success of the Chinese economy. The Chinese have been incredibly successful at catching this virus, stopping the virus, and it's about to restart. The Chinese economy is about to restart. When they do, take a look at the price of the steel manufacturers and the iron ore exporters in Australia. Because the one thing that's true about our Western economy is we need energy and we need steel. There's virtually nothing in this economy that doesn't need steel. Cars, kitchens, clothes down to zips and things like that, the computers we're watching on, the cables that connect our computers to the internet. They're all driven around the export of raw materials that Australians dig out of the ground. So all of these things are going to be the subject of a massive Chinese expansion. They have to regain where they were. The politics of the world demands it. And as a result, I expect we're going to see a monstrous recovery in China, which is going to have very positive knock-on effects to Australia. All of this, of course, is conditional upon this virus being controlled by the measures that they're using at the moment. I do feel a fairly high degree of confidence that's going to happen, because historically, the governments do act to shore up the markets when they fall. That has happened in this case on an absolutely unprecedented level. There is no doubt that shutting down the country like Australia's done and America's now doing, and China and Italy and Spain and the UK, that will have a recessionary effect. The chance of avoiding a recession, I think, is almost zero. But what they're trying to avoid is a sustained recession or a depression. Now, the amount of money they're spending is staggering. It will work. There's almost no scenario where it won't work. There is one exception here that I find fascinating that nobody's talking about, and it's this. It's India. We're not seeing any news out of India when it comes to the virus. I think India basically can't really control the spread of the virus, and so they're simply not talking about it. Curiously enough, though, in a market where the Chinese have pushed every other trading partner of Australia down backwards, the Indians have actually increased their share of our export market. Now, that's a growing market over a 10-year period, and it's not a huge amount, but do not misunderstand the importance of India. They're just as big as China, and they've got a phenomenal economic success story. It's just not as good as the Chinese. Essentially, it's because India is a democracy and China is not a democracy. But that doesn't mean that the slower path that India has taken, which is still the envy of the rest of the world, it doesn't mean the slower path that India has taken won't be a very positive thing for Australia. We produce the best coal in the world. We produce the best oil or gas in the world. We are stable economically and politically. We are extremely close to India in terms of the amount of time it takes to ship materials there. And India is growing, and they're growing quite quickly. So this is a very positive story for Australia, notwithstanding the 10 to 15% correction that was always going to come. It's been exacerbated by this virus, but there's so many positive numbers in the data that if we can simply hold our own, we're going to do well. So we'll just pause for a second if anyone has any questions. Chris, I'm not seeing anybody. Does anyone have any questions you want to ask? Okay. Looks like I'm either fascinating or I'm overwhelming you with slides and graphs and charts. I do apologise with the death by statistics, but I suppose it's the way my head works. I go looking at the numbers and looking at the data. Please feel free to ask any questions as we go. All right. So how does this affect me? We've talked about the virus. We've talked about the markets. We've talked about economies. Let's talk about mum and dad. So this was a report that I took from a client 3 days ago. I've made this Mr. Trump. So it's not anyone you know. The interesting piece here is if you look at the returns across the board, they're actually relatively manageable. So the average return for the 12 months to 16 March on this portfolio was actually only -3%. There were plenty of -11s and -10s in there, right? They're absolutely there. But there are also some positive numbers, right? Some 4s and 3s and things like that. They're coming from fixed interest, which are doing quite well in this period. So what's actually happened? We've seen a very positive 20% year in the lead up, followed by a 30% decline in the market. So that's given us this sort of -8s and -10 figures. But what people are finding is that their portfolios are not catastrophically down. They're definitely down, but thank God there was a strong year in the lead up. Now, I want to come back to how we structure your money and how it works. So most of our clients are in the retirement phase. Most of our clients are more interested in the income they get from their investments than growing their portfolio. Yet the media is compulsively obsessed with the growth that happens in the portfolio. So that all we ever hear about on the TV is growth. We never hear about dividends from the stock market and things like that, and dividends from bond yields and so forth. Now, the majority of our clients, as I said, are in this category here. Some of you are in this category, and we have a handful in here. Largely what we're seeing at this point is to a certain extent the recession we had to have, or the depression or the virus we had to have, after a period of very strong returns. So most clients are not suffering too much. It's disappointing to go backwards as much as we have, but we were in better shape beforehand than most people realize. So if we look at how we actually structure your portfolios, how we manage your money, we could manage for maximum return, which means, you know, we can look at shares and property and currency and commodities. You subject yourself to a lot of market swings like we're enduring at the moment. It's a very uncomfortable journey for most retirees, and it does give you the best economic result long term, unless you are taking your money out of the market at the wrong time, which is right now. So we would no sooner fly to the moon than put all your money in the stock market, because you can't recover from a stock market downturn if you take money out of it over the course of the next 12 months. So we could manage for minimum risk, right? That would mean we'd stick your money in cash. Now, low return, it's not even low return, it's basically zero. Zero risk, but zero return. So you can't lose money unless inflation destroys the value of your money. And that's what's happening. As people are taking money out of their cash portfolios, they're not earning anything. So all you're doing is you might as well put the money on the bed and just take cash and spend it down at the supermarket. Most people want to be seeing a return of 4, 5, 6% to make sure their money lasts long enough in their retirement that they enjoy their retirement. So our perspective is that we would much rather manage for maximum certainty of your income. And this is an important consideration. How do we structure your money to make sure your income in retirement is not affected? And we do that by balancing low risk and growth assets, and it's an obvious sort of statement. We need to have good managers that are good at what they do, and we need to have different managers with different styles and different underlying investments. But we want to focus on building a portfolio to meet every client's individual needs. Now, some clients spend more than others. Some clients need to take a more conservative approach. Some clients need to have a higher earning rate. All of those are considerations. But if we look at the way we structure your money, we have a defensive side of your portfolio, which is government bonds and cash. And then we have the growth side of your portfolio, which is property and shares and whatnot. Now, my mouse is misbehaving again. There we go. The way we structure it, though, is we start by saying, how much income do you need? Do you need 20,000 a year, 30,000 a year, 40,000 a year? And we make sure where possible that we've got 1 to 2 years of your income needs in cash. We've got another couple of years of your income needs here in bonds, right? And that allows us to put the balance of your money over here in the growth assets. In doing it this way, we're able to pay you the income you need. We shuffle the money around internally and we use cash to feed you your income. But from time to time, we have to take profits out of the growth side to top up the low risk side. And we do that fairly consistently. There are 2 ways we can do it. The way many of you have is what we call an auto rebalance, where we actually move your portfolio into a fixed allocation, be it 60-40, 50-50, 70-30, and we feed you your income there and the portfolio is constantly rebalancing. That works quite well. The superior way of doing it, though, is the manual rebalance, where we actually pick the time and date where we take money out of the growth assets to move across to the bottom side. So a period like now, for example, is a time where you don't take money out of the growth assets. You wait the 6 or 12 months or 2 years it takes before the markets recover and take your profits out. Unfortunately, in many ways, the manual rebalance takes a bit more time and effort, because every client has a different particular need and different portfolio mix. So manual rebalance belongs to our highest service levels. Auto rebalance applies to our bronze service level. So we would have spoken about that with you. If we haven't, or you want a refresher, please ask. So when we look at a portfolio constructed this way, so the graph I showed you, the chart I showed you before, it starts to look a bit more logical, right? We've got the cash down here, and there's $35,000 in cash there. So that's a couple of years of income for this client. We've got another 60, 70, $80,000. What's that? Yeah, it's close to $80,000, right? So there's 3 years of this client's income. And then the balance of monies are invested in the market in shares and property and infrastructure and currencies and oil and so forth. Now, these are the ones that have suffered, right? They're all negative, with the exception of this one path fund here. The beauty is, though, if we're looking at, say, a $17,000 a year income that we need to take out, this side of the equation, the low risk stuff, has got somewhere in the order of $115,000 worth of income in there, of capital in there, which creates an environment where you don't need to touch the growth side of your portfolio for another 5 or 6 years. So this is how we like to structure client portfolios. If you keep enough money in the low risk side, you can put up with the vicissitudes, the ups and downs of the growth side of the portfolio. And I think many of you have had that conversation with me, but we really do have it with you every year. It works. It just plain works. It is not necessarily the most exciting journey, but as we say, to use a Sir Humphrey Appleby reference from Yes, Prime Minister, I don't want you to accuse me of being courageous with your money. If anything, I'd rather you accuse me of being dull. I don't apologise for being dull. So here's some interesting graphs. Many of you have seen these graphs before. These are the what happened to your stock market fund. So in this case, it's 10,000 in the Australian share market, grew to be worth about $25,000 from 2004 to 2008. It then crashed, the global financial crisis. And for those that left it alone, the portfolio grew to worth about $40,000. Now, for those that said, oh, look, I'll just get out for a little while and I'll wait for a positive sign before I get back in, and we will just get in and out and we'll just judge it and we'll make sure we don't take too much risk, we end up with an absolutely abysmal outcome. I am not smart enough, I hope you understand when I say it, I am not smart enough to tell you which days out of the 5,000 days in this graph were going to be the good days. I'm just not that clever. If I was, I'd be flying around in a gold-plated helicopter and you wouldn't need to spend time with me. What we know is that, like a marriage, that anybody who goes into a marriage thinking it's going to be nothing but a Hollywood movie is in trouble, right? There are good years and there are bad years. There's far more good years than bad, but you need to be able to put up with the bad so that you can enjoy the benefits of it long term. And I think that's as good an analogy of investing as any. Pick your spouse carefully, understand what you're doing when you enter into this relationship, and then commit to each other that you're going to stay in this as it goes through the ups and downs. From our perspective, you've chosen us and we're very humbled by that. We then go on to choose fund managers that we think are worthy of your money, and we watch them very, very closely. If they get offline or they start to do something stupid, we will move the money away from them. However, once we've committed and we know we've got a quality partner to use as an investment portfolio, we will give them time to have their ups and downs, because you need to basically believe in what they're doing. Now, this is the Chinese stock market. 10,000 was worth 60,000 if you left it alone, or 6,000 if you took the 40 best days out of it. So the Chinese market behaves the same as the Australian market. The US market's $45,000 over the period, or 7. So again, we're seeing the exact same behavior. The bit that really does bug me about our beloved media is that they're not interested in telling you the truth. They're interested in telling you the most emotional story they can. They want the headline. If we look here at where the Australian stock market has gone since 1992, up until basically 6, 8, 9 months ago, right? We're talking about, 27 years. So $100, if you just talked about what they report on the TV every night, your $100 would have grown in price to $400. So the price index grew by 4 times in that 27-year period. Yet the accumulation index, which is the orange line here, which is all the dividends. So if you take the dividends into account, which can be used to buy more shares or can be used to buy coffee and holidays and cars, right? It's entirely up to you. But you factor the income into this equation and the return was not 4x, it was 12x. So if you look at 11 units of gain here from the original 100 base point, 3 times of it was price, 8 times was dividends. So it's almost disingenuous to be reporting the price index on the television every night. But that's what the media insists on doing, because they're not telling you the story that's most interesting. Because to be quite frank, the dividends just keep coming. We can look at the share price of, if you pick on one the other day, Commonwealth Bank, right? My mother, who's online, I hope you don't mind, Mum, I'm just going to share this story. In the global financial crisis, the Commonwealth Bank fell from $80 down to $27. So we bought some shares, right? And then over a period of time, the shares grew back to about $80 or $90. The other day, they fell down to $57, right? So I bought some more Commonwealth Bank shares at that point because the dividends didn't fall in all that time. They took through the global financial crisis. They paused at the same level. They didn't grow, they paused, right? So what we've seen is over a period of time, the Australian banking system has continued to deliver strong growth in profits over a 25-year period. But that's not reported in the media, right? So when we tell you that you've earned 8% or 10% return, we're taking into account the income. You're not always seeing the share price of the underlying shares reflected there. You're taking the dividends into account. And to me, it would be a lot easier in this world if the government would tell you, the media would tell you that over the course of the year, the price might be down 10%, but it paid 8% in dividends. So let's get into a conversation about how this affects you as an individual. Now, there's a couple of ways I can do this, but I'm just going to introduce Bruce Springsteen and Shania Twain as my sample clients. Fans of both of them, for many of you, you already know that. Let's assume Bruce and Shania had $300,000 invested. Their cost of living with caravanning, kids, grandkids, etc., was about $1,000 a week. And that's pretty legitimate. While they're healthy and active, and they've got that first part of retirement going where they're actually enjoying themselves and getting around, it makes sense that their cost of living is a bit higher. By the time they get into their late 70s or early 80s, the cost of living will drop a little bit. All right. Now, taking into account, and I might, if you can just allow me to jump out of this for a second, I'm going to show you the spreadsheet that I use to do this with. Because it becomes quite an interesting exercise. Now, can someone just put their hand up to say they see the spreadsheet on the screen? Okay, excellent. Just to communicate what we're doing here. So on the bottom of the screen, we're seeing the cost of living and the income for the client. The income is comprised of their age pension, which are the dark blue bars, a little bit of tax refund from the shares they hold, and the green bars are the dividends from investments or from pensions and things like that. Does that make sense? Now, what happens as their cost of living sort of starts at the 50-odd thousand a year and grows with inflation here for the first 10 years? So by the time they get to their, the 10-year mark, their cost of living is actually closer to 70,000, not 50-odd thousand a year, right? We're seeing that their capital declines a little bit. Right? And to be quite honest, that's perfectly okay. What's the point in having this money and retiring with it if you're not going to enjoy it, right? I know my daughter's listening online. The whole point of this, Katie, is it's called skiing. It's spending the kids' inheritance, right? Your parents have worked for this money. They intend to use a bit of it so that they can enjoy the time where they've got their health left. The kids will get what they get. Many kids only get the house. Some of you get a little bit of the money as well. But what happens here at the 10-year mark, right? We see the fund turns around and it starts to grow again because mum and dad are spending less. Now, what's really going on is mum and dad want to keep spending, but there's a giant rubber band between the mum and dad and the doctor. Right? They can only get so far before the rubber band pulls them back. I've got to go to a specialist, my hip. I've got to go to a specialist, my heart. I've got to go to get my eyes done, right? You can only get a month or two away before the doctor drags you back again. And I think we all know, and I'm seeing some laughter there from the people online, I'd love to, but I have a specialist appointment. We can't do it that month because I've got to do this, that, and the other. I actually look forward to the time when a lot of the medicine is delivered via the internet. You can be wherever you damn well please. Because we all know that sometimes a specialist appointment is 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and not much happens there. But the drug test can be done anywhere. But we're going to see an interesting time here, anyway, where Bruce and Shania's money continues to grow a little bit, and so the kids will inherit a bit more. Now, in this model, Bruce and Shania decide they want to take a holiday. Perhaps Bruce has promised Shania, next year we're going to do the boats in Europe. Next year we're going to do that Rhine cruise. Next year, I've been promising it for years. And Shania says, okay, I'll take the cruise. So now we're seeing this lump of money spending here. So it's an expensive year, okay? And then Bruce says, in exchange for that, I want to get myself a new ute, right? It's going to cost $25,000. This one will last me for another 4 or 5 years, but then I would like to buy another car, please. And Shania says, okay, if I get the trip on the boats through Europe, you can have your new ute, right? But Shania is a good negotiator, and she says, and we need a new kitchen, and we need a new bathroom. And Bruce says, you can have those as long as I get my carport, right? So over the course of the next 6 years, there's 3 big spends of $15,000 on the house somewhere, somehow, who knows how, right? Now we're starting to get a totally different graph appearing. We're seeing a scenario where the spending is all over the place. It was smooth before, if you remember. Now, that's what you always see in the newspapers and on the articles where they show this beautiful smooth graph as clients retire, right? I don't know about any of you, but my life is not smooth. It's good, but it's lumpy, right? As my wife, who's also listening online, we're $10,000 poorer because my children were supposed to be going to China with my wife in about 2 weeks' time on a band tour with a performing arts band. We might get the $10,000 we spent. We might get $100,000 back because most of it's in China. I don't know that we're getting it back. So there's a lump that I wasn't expecting. But anyway, it is what it is. Now, let's go back to our graph here. What we're seeing is that Bruce and Shania's capital is now declining quite markedly. That's perfectly okay. By the time they slow down, they're down to their last $100,000. That's okay. But actually, I'm going to change these figures slightly. That's actually $100,000 CPI adjusted. So if we talk about raw dollars, you're going to see that they're actually down to their last $150,000 when their lifestyle slows them down. So our job at this point as financial planners is to give them the life they want to give them the life they want to lead, and make sure the money facilitates this without taking undue risk. So if I go back to the sort of idea we were talking about, if we know that this spending pattern is in front of Bruce and Shania for the next 5 or 10 years, we need to make sure the money's in the right place at the right time. So a stock market collapse means that then they're still able to take their holidays. They're still able to take their trips. Now, it's not a bad idea for Bruce and Shania to put the trip off for a year or two, or put off the purchase of a new car or the kitchen for a year or two if the market's down. Right? But we're not compulsive, obsessive about that, because if we've done our job properly, we should have allowed for that in the way your portfolio is structured. So you guys should be able to enjoy yourself in retirement, regardless of what the markets do, whether they go up or down. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to come back here to my charts. I'll drag this across now because I've gone off script a little. I hope you can forgive me. So this is the graph that we had. That's a similar graph. What happens now, I'll see if I can put the slides up now. What happens if Bruce needs to go into aged care? How does that work? So if we look at aged care, and I'm sorry, I'm going to throw some more numbers at you as I go in here. There's a variety of expenses associated with aged care. Now, on the flip side, your cost of living will drop if one of you or both of you go into aged care, but on the flip side, the cost of care goes up. So the first thing that people need to be aware of is that there is a bond. It's called a RAD, refundable accommodation deposit. In the Hunter Valley, it tends to be somewhere in the order of $350,000 to $450,000. If you don't pay all of that bond, you sign a contract, but you only pay half of the bond, you've got to pay about 5% interest on the balance. It's called a daily accommodation payment or a DAP, but to be blunt, it's interest on the debt. Now that actually dropped it's dropping tomorrow, or is it the 1st of April? It's dropping to 4.89%. Forgive me, that was my phone. Now, there is a basic daily care fee, which is a fee everybody pays. It's 85% of their age pension. It's about $52 and something a day. That's about $19,000 a year. Everybody has to pay that. Then there is a means tested care fee, which is somewhere between nothing and $10,000 a year. Then there is an extra services fee, right? If your assets are below $50,000, they can't make you pay a bond or extra fees. If your assets are below $150,000, they can't make you pay a bond, but they do make you pay a daily contract. Anyway, you're right, it's complicated. I have to stay at this every week to keep this stuff straight in my head, and numbers are not my weak spot, so it's a challenge. But what happens if we put Bruce into aged care? Now, if we go back to our picture here, Bruce's assets were down around $135,000 by the time he got towards 85 or whatever when we're going to put him in aged care, because he had spent the money on holidays. Bruce and Shania had spent it. They'd actually enjoyed themselves. They'd been cautious with the way they spent money, but they didn't hoard it. As a result, that meant that their assets were below the $170,000 line and they didn't have to pay a bond. Right? The basic daily care fee was $19,000. They didn't have to pay a means tested care fee. The extra services fee is basically just for coffee and a sherry with his evening meal and getting his haircut and things like that. He did have to pay an extra fee called a daily accommodation contribution. So Bruce's total cost of going to aged care was about $35,000 a year. But Shania's cost of living drops because she doesn't have to feed and care for Bruce. So it's a bit of swings and roundabouts. So the cost of care for Bruce in this set of numbers was down around $25,000 a year. And yes, it's complicated, right? How does this actually affect Bruce? It looks like this, right? The red line is what happened if Bruce didn't go into aged care. The blue line is what happens if Bruce had to go into aged care. It definitely costs a little more. There's no question about that. But it doesn't cost so much that they can't afford it. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to show you one other one because there was a wrinkle in these numbers which I found hilarious. If Bruce and Shania's assets actually grow too much, then they get into the area where they have to pay a bond, right? So if I took out some of this spending on holidays and I took out some spending on the renovations, maybe Bruce gets to buy his new car because he's like that. If we look at the aged care situation, Bruce ends up in this example. Whoops, that one's a bit small. Having to pay a bond of $450,000 because they have too much money. Because they have too much money, they have to pay the refundable accommodation deposit and Shania runs out of money. And that's a terrible situation. So in this instance, we might say, okay, perhaps we'll pay 150,000 towards Bruce's bond, right? Which means that Shania will have to pay a bit of interest called the daily accommodation payment. That's the 4.81% interest on the balance of the bond, right? And now we're back in a relatively similar scenario again, okay? So believe it or not, the way the aged care system works, it makes sense for Shania to take her holiday to Europe and to get renovations on the house, because the need to pay that bond, well, not 150, the need to pay that bond disappears if they keep their assets below a certain threshold. Okay? So just to rehash all of this, we see our job as to understand you and your numbers and your lifestyle sufficiently well that we can make sure the money's in the right place and is not affected too much by stock market crashes and corrections. If we can do that, that allows you to go to the places you want to go and do the things you want to do, and to leave the money in the market to recover. We've already seen the scenarios where left alone, sorry, I'm just about to bring the slides back again, guys. Left alone, the markets will recover and reward. I'll just come back here. So this graph was talking about how the stock market will recover if you allow it, right? And the way we do that is to structure your money so that we've got money on the low risk side of things. And this is how we structured your portfolios. For many of you, you've heard me say this so many times that you're bored with this part of the webinar, right? But our job is to become the world authority in you and to understand what you need your money to do. We then structure the investments accordingly. We still want the growth assets that are going to earn 6, 8, 10, 12%. But we don't want to have your money solely in them, because when they have a bad year, you're taking money out of them and losing the advantage that comes from just time. So we talk about on this side of the equation, on the defensive side, this is an insurance policy that allows your money time to recover. Okay? So we're getting close to the end of the session. So if anyone's got any questions, please jot them down now. But largely, I'm just going to finish on this notion here, that we see our job as your financial planners as helping you to make good decisions. Good decisions are fairly self-evident at times. They're, where do I put my money? What do I do with it that gets a reasonable return? We also see our job as helping you avoid bad decisions. Now, bad decisions come in two types. Type one, putting your money in the wrong place, you lose money, right? So bad investment, films or trees or some sort of penny stock. The type two bad decision, which is where I think most people tend to make a mistake, is that they don't do things they could have done because they didn't have enough sense of understanding of their own numbers and their own story going forward from here. So this would be a decision about whether you could renovate the house or change houses, whether you could afford a new car, take a holiday, help the children, right? You've got to be mindful of what the impact is on the age pension and the tax situation. You've got to be mindful of an aged care need if it comes down the path. However, we see our job as helping you make these decisions better. So we want to help you manage the things that need to be managed, look forward to the things that will matter, and avoid any pitfalls along the way. So very much we see our job as a navigator. So that's about it. We're getting up to the 90-minute mark. I have a fairly high degree of optimism, not because what's going on around the world is not serious, it's extremely serious. But they're throwing a lot of money at it. The story out of China and South Korea is that the economy goes into lockdown for 4 weeks to 6 weeks. The Spanish and the Italians have been forced into that situation, so they may lose a few more people. But the scale of the coronavirus mortality is a fraction of what the annual flu impact is. It's a fraction of what the swine flu impact was. The most important thing is that we behave responsibly and intelligently, and that we go back to work quietly and efficiently when we can. And I think everybody in the country is going to do that, with very few exceptions. I think the media goes looking for those silly videos that they show of people fighting in the supermarket, but I imagine all of you have been to the supermarket, and other than not being able to get toilet paper, and if anybody needs it, I do have 200 or 300 meters of old newspaper roll at home, so it hasn't even got ink on it. Some's available, and subject to demand. I'm not intending to charge anybody. Call it a public service. I have actually a fairly high degree of optimism. This is going to slide behind us from an investment point of view fairly quickly. From a political and cultural point of view, I think we're going to be asking ourselves some fairly strong questions over the course of the next year or so. I'm not 100% convinced that the media has been our friend in all of this. I hope that my views aren't too controversial, but certainly at this point, this is the team. I think you've met most of us. The 5 gentlemen on the top row are the advisors. Louise is our paraplanner. She's brilliant. Heather's been here for 21, 22 years. Olga, 7 years. Courtney for a couple of years. Jan and Laura and Kylie have been here for about 12 months as well. We actually take our relationship with you very seriously, and our responsibility very seriously. We want to answer your questions. We want the phone calls. We know you trust us, and it's a very humbling thing that you do. And our job at this point is not to predict this sort of crisis. You can't predict these things. But our commitment to you is that we'll be available when they happen, that we're going to do everything we can to adapt to them as well as we can. And as the world story changes and the political story changes and the investment market change, we're going to help you adapt as you go along. So at this point, failing any questions, thank you very much for listening to me. Oh, there are questions. Thank you. All right, I'll have a look at the chat. It's come up. What happens if the share market is frozen, no sales, as is from Ron McSpiron, and the present funds stay fixed? Well, for starters, I actually think there is a chance that they're just going to close the stock markets for a little while if it gets too silly. The government will fund, thank you, Laura. The government will fund a lot of the companies to keep them afloat. But essentially, if the stock market's frozen, then the managed funds can't sell. And so that portion of your portfolio will be frozen for a week or a month or 3 months or 6 months. It has happened in the past. Experience taught us with the mortgage funds from 10 years ago with the GFC that it can take up to 12 months or so to get the vast bulk of your money back. There's always the odd stragglers, but we could be looking, Ron, at leaving your money there for 12 months or so. But to be frank, that's sort of our advice anyway, is to leave the money there and allow it to bounce upwards. So the next question, how much confidence have you that the government will react quickly once the situation begins to improve? They seem to be very conservative, and I fear they will stop travel and business activity for 6 months just to be sure. Well, you're asking my opinion there. The answer is most governments tend to do what the business leaders ask them to do because the business leaders give them the money. If you see graphs like the story with China and Korea, the risk to the community only lasted 4 to 6 weeks. So domestic travel, we're in that scenario now with the group that I'm a part of, where domestic travel has been curtailed for a period. It could be a 4 to 6 week period, but what the whole agenda here is not to stop the virus, but to slow it down so that it doesn't spread like wildfire. Because if you can slow it down, then the people can get the medical care and they isolate themselves and it doesn't travel any further. This virus is particularly nasty in that it seems to have the perfect amount of infectability or contagion rate. Whilst it is not particularly deadly, it's easy to spread and it takes a few days before the symptoms become evident to everybody. So I don't think the government's going to lock this country down for 12 months because that would be catastrophic for it to do that. So I think they're just going to hold the freeze of business activity and the travel for perhaps 2 to 4 weeks. After that, they're going to be banning people coming in from certain countries, and they're going to introduce what they had before, which was if you've come from certain countries, you have to go into quarantine for 14 days because slowing the economy down by banning all travel is too nasty. So, so I've got a question here, Ron. Alternative. This is from Ron McSparron. Can we process the alteration effective 17 April 2020, which will not require request for CPI rejection? To be honest, I'm not 100% sure what that question means, Ron. So perhaps if you want to take that with me offline, I'd be more than happy to take your call. That seems to be all the questions. I hope you got value. I did tend to do these things technical, but that's what happens when the markets behave like this. You just got to dive and look at the underlying things. The price of oil being cheap is a good thing. The impact on our share market's not a good thing. I think we're going to see some geopolitical things happen in Europe because what Russia's done is a piece of thuggism. It's outright mafiosi bullying. But they are going to be spending so much money to restart this economy. It's a bit scary. So there's every chance that we're going to see a very rapid bounce. But certainly, I suspect we're going to see over the course of the next couple of months, my expectation, which is not advice, it is simply my opinion, we're going to see a bounce of 15 to 20% in the share market because that's what the fear of this virus has caused. And when the fear goes away, then we should see the recovery. I really hope that's the case. Certainly, I've been investing money on that basis because there's an old phrase in the market says you never waste a crisis. Or as Warren Buffett says, you sell when the taxi driver is buying and you buy when the taxi driver is selling. So we've been, as many of you know, unwinding some of the positions you've got and pushing you back to a more conservative position over the last 12 months. So again, that's been quite timely. And whilst we saw some of this correction happening, we certainly didn't see the virus happening. So Chris, I don't know if there are any other questions, but failing that, if anyone wants to type something now, I'll hang on for a minute or two. But that's pretty much the end of our slides. I hope it's been... There is a final question, is there? No other questions. Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for your time. We will be running a face-to-face session again in a month or two when this period is over. So the promise of jam and scones, scones and cream and jam is still on. I hope you've all got value out of today. I've basically just talked for 90 minutes, but to me, this is the best country in the world, and I think everybody behaves intelligently and responsibly. So if it can be done properly, it'll be done properly here, and I think it is. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. I do appreciate you tuning in today. If you have any questions, please email us or come back to us. This slide deck will be made available to you. We will actually be releasing it as a video, and subject to everything working properly, I hope to release that today or on Monday at the latest. So thank you very much, everybody, and take care and God bless.